I always say I need a glass of whiskey, and that will be to mark the start of the occasion. I'll be able to tap the glass then. Look, welcome all to the Geary Institute this evening, and to all our colleagues online as well, to a lovely occasion, a very important occasion. I just want to acknowledge Julie, Roy Geary's granddaughter, who's with us, I think, and great grandson as well, who are with us this evening for this event. So it's the event of passing of the Roy Geary's papers to the archives here in UCD, and we have Kate, who's principal archivist here. Michelle Norris from Geary Institute has been really fantastic organising, working with us all to make this evening happen. I just want to, in advance, thank the speakers, because this is the safest way to do it, so I won't forget anybody. Patrick, Alan, Martina is here as well, and also Sarah, who's stepped in at the last minute to replace Marianne Cassidy. But we'll have a fantastic, I think, suite of discussions here today. The topic, the evolution of those data needs for policy and decision making. There's a nice arc, I think, to the presentations that we're going to see from the biographical aspect, the historical aspect, the research aspect, and then into current and future demands and needs for what we would say statistics, for data and information to inform society. I just wanted to acknowledge Roy Geary's contribution, obviously, to the world of official statistics. He was the first director of the CSO. Previous to that, he had led the statistics branch, which was part of the Department of Industry and Commerce. He drafted with his colleagues a very powerful note or memo on the need for an independent statistical office, and to be independently established under the Department of the Taoiseach. There were some, what would you call it, reservations, Department of Finance, weren't at all sure, but I think that the case was very strong, and the importance of the office was well understood. Just looking back at the focus at the time, it's really interesting, because Dr. Geary took up the appointment there in 1949 as director of the CSO. And one of the first things they did was to move on a large scale household budget survey. Their areas of focus were around national income, what would be national accounts now, HBS, household budget survey, to inform not just the national income, but also cost of living, to help with the measuring those kind of indicators. Also very interested in farm income surveys, crop yield surveys, because that was the dominant sector at the time. And this was the data that was needed for decision making back then. So it's very interesting to see that. Then also, I think in 1951, they moved into a quarterly survey of hotels, because again, it was the focus, the growing tourism sector in Ireland as well, and that was where the need for data was. And then the other, I suppose, big initiative that happened at the time was a lot of focus on sample survey design, and that was again around how do we get the data. Hardest thing is to get the bit of data, get good data, to get quality data. That was the foundation of all of the work that we're going to do. So it just reflects the areas of kind of policy and economic focus at the time, and I suppose that focus from the start around quality and best practice for official statistics. And it just, I suppose, it aligns now with where we're looking for CSO, looking into the future, the independence, the trust that we hope is there across society and international Bureau of Statistics, our user needs, the proliferation and growth of data sources, and how we work to mine those data sources to meet the increasing and valid user needs that are coming at us, the methodological and standards work that we do to make sure, again, that we're hitting the quality marks and that we're giving a level of granularity, consistency and coherence in the outputs, and also, I suppose, supporting the broader statistical system really to move kind of beyond CSO into an era of integrated standards-based data and statistics for Ireland. So at parallels with it was just really interesting to see them focusing on the key sectors and key methodologies, and it's still kind of the two strands of our strategy today. So look, I'll pass to Michelle, who's going to choreograph a lot of what's going to happen this evening, and she'll introduce the different speakers as they come along. I hope everybody really enjoys the event, whether you're here in person or online. And I'll catch up with you again maybe at the end of the evening. Thanks so much. Thank you.
So thank you, everybody. I'm Michelle Norris. I'm the director of the Geary Institute for Public Policy, named in honour of Roy Geary. And I'm really grateful to everyone for coming along to attend this evening's event. So as you can see from the agenda, we've included a mix of some reminiscences about Roy Geary as a person and his career, and then some papers that build on his legacy in terms of use of official statistics and data to inform policy. So just to start, since this evening's event is to mark the donation, very kind donation of Roy Geary's archive by the Geary family to UCD Library, I'd like to call on Kate Manning, who's the principal archivist in UCD Library, just to say a few words. Just speak into this.
Thank you, Michelle. Good evening, everyone. I'm going to speak extremely briefly. I just wanted to say how delighted we were when, I think, Michelle, it was you who got in touch first about the donation of Roy Geary's papers to UCD Archives. So we are thrilled to add his papers to not only as a distinguished graduate of UCD, but his papers will also sit alongside the papers of Garrett Fitzgerald. They'll sit alongside the papers of T.K. Whittaker. I think they've found a good home, and we look forward to their cataloguing and getting them out in the world. We're in the middle of a big refurbishment project at the moment, so it'll probably be 2028. But that's our hope. So we are delighted to the family for their very kind donation. We are deeply appreciative of it. We are very glad to add Roy's papers to the distinguished set of papers that already exist in UCD Archives. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Do you want to go next? Don't worry. I'll leave everyone take a seat. So our next speaker needs no introduction. Patrick, but a man among Patrick Honohan's many achievements. He is a graduate of this university. I have to mention that. But also during his very wide and varied career, and during which he's made an enormous contribution to public policy in this country and internationally, he worked with Roy Geary for a period. So Patrick's now going to speak, I think, about his contribution and career. Now,
thank you.
This is our
okay. Thank you very much. I've been given 10 minutes to talk about Roy Geary, and I hope the selection of what I'm going to say suits everybody, but I think it suits. Yes, I'm looking at the audience in here, and I think it will. So the main features: born 1896 in Dublin, grew up in Drumcondra, went to O'Connell schools, Christian Brothers, like James Joyce, but not a little bit later than James Joyce. Got a bachelor's degree in mathematics and mathematical physics, UCD, in 1916. I think that degree is no longer offered. It was offered until about 20 years ago, but I think now it's statistics has sort of crept in and taken the role of mathematical physics. So I'll think about that. He got a master's the following year. I want to show you that. I want to show you, but I haven't managed to. Tell me what to do to get it sent. Oh, yeah, use that one. Pin that microphone. Oh, it has a pin. Oh, that's right. You're the technology expert, obviously. I can do it. And just pin it like that. Yeah. Nope. Where am I pointing it at? What machine? Is it this machine? Yeah. Let's do it. Okay, there are not many pictures of Roy Geary on the web, particularly nothing except this one that I found of him as a young man. Can you find him there? This is the year he got his master's. This is a very early group of master's graduates at UCD, and anyway, I'll show you which one it is. Oh, come on! Use the button. Which button? There are a lot of buttons. No, and some of them killed it. Yeah, there we are. So there he is, Roy Geary. This is E.J. Conway, a very distinguished biochemist, graduated the same year. This is Phyllis Ryan, one of the brainy Ryan girls from Wexford, and she married Shanti O'Kelly. In those days, who did you marry was probably all you could manage in the public service anyway. But anyway, Phyllis Ryan, she married Shanti O'Kelly, President of Ireland later. I don't know who the other people are. That gives you an impression of UCD in 1917. He went on to study in Paris. He got a traveling studentship. He went on to study in Paris in the Sorbonne. And any of you mathematics graduates here will know some of the names of the people he studied with. Borel, Goursat, Lebesgue. He married in 1927. He had 2 children. He died in Dublin in 1983. Now, into a little bit more detail. After he studied in Paris, he accepted a lectureship in Southampton. He never took it up. He veered from that to a civil service job. He'd already accepted it, but he didn't actually go to Southampton. He took the civil service job in Dublin. He had applied for the job in the statistics branch of the Industry and Commerce Department. They said, well, we don't have any vacancies. So he was off to Southampton. And then he said, well, actually, we do. And really, that set his career. The statistics branch, as Jennifer has mentioned, evolved into an independent CSO, of which he became the first director in 1949. When he reached 60, he was ready to retire from early retirement from the CSO, and UCD offered him a chair, but not with very much money. So he didn't. Instead, he went to the United Nations, became the chief of the National Accounts Branch. So he's there from 57 to 60. He was the first director of the ESRI, ERI in 1960. He did retire eventually then from 66 at the age of 70, but continued as a consultant until his death in 1983. Okay, now let me say a few things about applied statistics in Ireland. But peculiarly, I put up a bit of mathematics because, I mean, how can you illustrate statistics except lots of numbers that people can't read? But this is Roy Geary's idea of applied statistics. To an extent, he was a chip off the old block, by the way. His father was a civil servant whose job at the General Registrar's office involved him in the 1901, 1911, and 1926 censuses. Geary père was elected to membership of this society in 1923, Geary fils the following year. And our Roy Geary became honorary secretary of the Statistical and Social Inquiry Society of Ireland 100 years ago, 1926. And he continued in that role for 20 years and became president of the society in 1946 for another 5 years. So the CSO think they own Geary. The ESRI think they own Geary. UCD think they own Geary. But he was longer in the CIS society than he was in any of those. He was a prolific member of the society, publishing no fewer than 11 papers in the journal of the society, a score matched in the past century only by his boss in the Department of Industry and Commerce, Stanley Lyon, and by JCM Eason, managing director of the Bookshop and Publishers. And he was an active, not to say voluble, contributor to the post-paper discussions of the society. And I'll veer off on a little excursion here, but which I think illustrates the Roy Geary that those of us who remember him was a bit like. he discussed a paper. I discovered a paper by my godfather, the agricultural economist Frank Hussey. Frank produced a paper in 1936. It was a bit complicated. And apparently it was a bit complicated for the members of the society. And I'm sure that Frank Hussey was not altogether pleased with what was said by Roy. And I quote, "In most statistical societies, it is traditional that there should be one paper in each session completely incomprehensible to the great majority of members. And it was right that our society, as one of the oldest in the world, be true to this tradition. This is precisely the kind of paper which the society requires." Now, although Roy did acknowledge that members could at least appreciate the very practical importance of the problem and the significance of the results, Uncle Frank submitted no more papers to the society. Well, Geary invented fundamental statistical methods and then applied them in Ireland. And that's why I have this paper. This is his paper, famous paper. There are many famous papers. Journal of the Royal Statistical Society, 1930. It's on the distribution. Oops, its title is slid under there. But it's on the distribution of the quotient of normal variance, ratio of two normal variables. Okay, so it's getting pretty complicated, even right down here where the fonts are getting a bit small. And but in this paper, which is quite a short paper, he immediately applies the theory. And it's obviously this is a problem. The application came first. He said, how do I solve this problem? And then he worked out a new theory published in a big journal. And here's the problem. TB mortality, tuberculosis, big problem in Ireland, grew by 5% in one particular location, which is Castletown Superintendent Registrar's District, County Cork, between 1905 and 1924, whereas it fell by 40% on average across the country. So should we take Castletown Superintendent's data as being an outlier, something's going wrong here, some problem here, not falling, or is it just part of random fluctuations? This is a problem to do with ratios. It's the ratio of the fall in Castletown to the ratio in all the other country, all the other parts of the country. What is the probability that such an outlier would be found? And you need to use the time change because you can't just use the level because there's all sorts of other variables that will interfere with things. So this is the problem that he solved. I think nowadays we would say we have a problem. We look up the literature to see, but he had to invent it. Yeah, he also actually had a lengthy paper in our society's journal that year, reviewing tuberculosis on across the board on other different dimensions over 100 years. And in this one, he explored a conjecture that had come up in the United Kingdom about the role of land, the type of soil. Could that be affecting TB? And could it explain the high incidence of TB in Wexford? And so it's this paper, you can see, and it's all about the different regions in Wexford. You can see it's Wexford, very heavy. And what kind of soil do they have? It's not just Wexford, it's different parts of Wexford. So this paper is all about heavy calcareous clay outcropping at the surface, heavy calcareous clay mostly covered with a thin loamy. So he's really digging into this theory. Actually, the theory doesn't work, but it had come up and we needed to know about it because TB was an important problem. He had a kind of sabbatical year in Cambridge in 1946-47 before coming back to the new CSO. Now, Jennifer has mentioned the sorts of things that he did at the CSO. I don't have much to say about that, but I was struck by a quotation. John Spencer has a very nice, very extended account of Geary's life in a volume that was published by the IPA around the time of 100th anniversary of his birth. And apparently Geary said that one of the principal functions of official statistics is in the steadying of public opinion. Well, that's an interesting thought. I wouldn't have come up with it. So as I said, back to the United Nations, he went to the United Nations. He had done a little bit before with them in 1957. He's working on the national accounts, and he's working, a favorite topic of mine, but I won't say anything more than just that it's there. The method used for making international price comparisons, and this is the so-called Geary-Camas method. And he worked on that in New York, and there are two methods. This is the one that's used for the Penn World tables, but there's another one which is more commonly used now. It's an interesting problem, but I don't get diverted. Then he was the first director of the Economic Research Institute. When the society wrote to the Ford Foundation, which had money, like going writing to Microsoft or something like that now, or the divorced spouses of some of the prominent billionaires. That's where you get the money nowadays, I think. But he, so they wrote to the Ford Foundation, could you give us some money to set up a research institute? We think we can get Geary to head it up. And that was a big selling point with the Ford Foundation. He was well liked and modest, is what everybody says about his period as director of the ESRI, but he struggled to attract people to come to Ireland to help start. He got some people, but he was always failing to fill as many slots. Probably, I'm going to make a facetious comment, but God forbid. He actually submitted his resignation long before he retired. Actually, he said, "No, I give up. I can't get the people. I'm obviously no good. You please accept my resignation." They said, "No, certainly not." It was in this period, I think, that his poor opinion of economic theory came to the fore, which is a bit funny because he was the head of the Economic Research Institute. He didn't like the unrealistic abstractions of advanced mathematical economics. It wasn't the advanced mathematics that he complained about, obviously, but the underlying elementary logic that was assumed about how people behaved. He rejected that. He criticized econometrics for its almost slavish deference to economic ideas. Basically, he preferred, this is my interpretation, he preferred to plunge in with measurement of obvious concepts. Peter Neary put it a bit differently. He said Peter Neary was a great fan of Geary. He favored more the inductive than the deductive. But I remember he would make dismissive remarks at the most inappropriate places. We invited him to chair the presidential address of the Econometric Society, those slaves, it was in Trinity in the Econometric Society European meeting, Dublin 1982. James Merlis was the Nobel laureate who was giving the talk, and Geary pontificated about how awful economics and particularly econometrics was. It did not go down well. Jim Merlis was not pleased, and Peter Neary, because Peter was had been Jim's graduate student, was not pleased at all. Let me say just a few words about the mathematical papers before I finish. Clearly, he made significant contributions, especially in the 1930s and 40s, to fundamental but practical statistical questions. There's the famous Geary theorem, the Biometrica 1936. Geary theorem says this: if you've got a distribution there, you don't know what the distribution is, but you keep on taking random samples, and then you plot the mean against the variance for all the random samples. And if they're completely scattered independently, then what do you know? You know that the distribution is normal, is Gaussian. So that's known as the Geary theorem. I don't know that it's all that useful, but it's a sort of fundamental thing. You don't have to redo that. But it's also, as I also hinted in this case of the TB, he was very practical in things he chose to study. Take, for example, his Biometrica 1947 paper testing for normality. Now, what he's doing, he's very worried. If we assume normality, are we biasing ourselves? No, people say, well, normal is good, it might be a little, but it's normally good. Then he looked, supposing I change from normal to I think it's normal, but it's truly the kurtosis is bigger. in this paper, first of all, is frightening amounts of calculations. How could you get all that stuff right? I mean, that's ridiculous. And over here we have the actual probability. 2 is, no, there, 3 is the normal distribution. The probability is right. But if the true distribution has a kurtosis of 6 instead of 3, then you're out by a long way. You're going to reject it 21% of the time instead of 5% of the time. So, you know, it's a real beware, and it really narrows it down to answering the problem. Now, I'm nearly finished. He was very quick with mathematical manipulations. Everybody says that, and you can sort of see that. He's churning out these papers. They're short papers. He's no problem to do this sort of stuff. He saw very quickly that the Klein-Rubin linear expenditure system, which is being used to estimate demand systems, and the Stone-Geary utility function, which is used in theoretical models, they're the same. And he published that very quickly. Somebody else published it roughly at the same time as well. So he was sometimes a little bit unlucky because he didn't quite. I mean, some of the things that I mentioned are lasting and definitely due to him. But he was very close to being the leader in a few other things that other people got their names to. I find some of the papers quite hard to read, partly because of notational choices and some old-fashioned terminology, but mainly because each of them dips into the middle of a complex mathematical debate. So here's another one. I mean, so this is a Journal of the Royal Statistical Society, 1936. One of the things you see here is approximations. This like Taylor series and Maclaurin series and that. So he's doing these approximations. Because you only need approximations in statistics if the thing is going to, if you've got enough data, you can just say this is going to a rate of 1 over n or 1 over n squared. But you can see these approximations, this dot, 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 dot. He's really good at that, and they were providing very important results. But this goes on and on. Look, pages and pages of stuff. He plunged into current methodological debates, seeking to generalize or improve on authors such as T.W. Anderson, Gerhard Tintner, Harold Hotelling, and others. So these were giants. And he was there just saying, I'm just sitting here in the Department of Industry and Commerce. It occurs to me that the following approximations work better than yours. Oh, yeah, Geary of Dublin. Oh, yes, good point. His style was to make short, pointed, but important interventions in a methodological debate, but then move on. So I suppose that was inevitable if he was to hold the day job down. So, as I say, others were often working in parallel. He often didn't get full credit, though in my graduate textbook, 1967, Kendall and Stewart, which, you know, if they included you in the references, it was important because they didn't need to include people just to be nice. 8 references in the bibliography. There's a lot more to say. The many honors he received, Fellow of the Econometric Society, despite his comments, several other bodies, doctors from NUI and Queen's, and then, you know, as I say, there is a lot to say. John Spencer, the anniversary, this 100-year anniversary, gave the Geary lecture, which formed the basis of the book that I mentioned. And John Spencer was so interested in the topic, more interested than the audience. He went on for more than 2 hours. I will not do that. Thank you.
Thank you very much. One more to come. Thank you very much. And just to end the part of this evening that's focused on Roy Geary, I would like to. We're very lucky to have quite a few members of the Geary family here this evening, and I'd like to invite his granddaughter, Jill Dooney, who's going to, I think, share some personal reminiscences.
Yes, more personal and. Okay. Brian talked about UCD claiming him and the ESRI claiming him. well, I'd like to say that the family claim him as our beloved grandfather. So thank you for asking me to say a few words about him. So my name is Jill Dooney. I'm one of his older grandchildren. I'm here together with my sister, Emma Dooney, and my nephew, who is his great-grandson, Kevin and Sean McGovern. So they're the family members who are with us today. So our mother is Clodagh Geary, Clodagh Dooney. She was brought up in Leeson Park along with her older brother, Colm. So they're the two children that were referred to by Brian. In my childhood from 1965, we lived in Ticknock, very close to the Three Rock Mountain. Our grandparents came to visit every Sunday evening. And my grandfather, we have very fond memories of how he was with us and what we did. So they lived in Leeson Park, and more latterly, they lived near the canal, near Bagot Street. So some of the stories I want to tell are about my grandfather's spirited behaviour with us as children as we grew up. The first anecdote relates to those Sunday afternoons. So my grandfather used to collect up all the small change that came his way during the week. So then there was a very wild game called Scrabble. So my brother, who's Kevin's father, we were both about 9 or 8, and we had a little sister, Laura, who was about 3. So my grandfather's greatest joy was to throw all this money on the floor and have us scrabbling around, trying to push each other, make as much money as possible. So he would wind us up into a complete frenzy and then leave it to my parents to calm us all down and to settle the rows about who got the most money. And from then on, for the rest of the Sunday evening, he would go into his cryptic crosswords. And then often he would have a great idea. And these formulae that Brian showed us would all be around the rim of the newspaper, written in his pencil. So the newspaper had to go home with him because they were the great thoughts he had during the day. So that's one story. Another story relates to Christmas Day when Roy and I were about 15 and 16. My mother used to splash out on 1 bottle of wine for him on Christmas Day. My parents didn't drink, so there wasn't anything else in the house. And we at 15, 16 decided we were going to have a glass of wine. So at the end of the Christmas Day, he was heard to say to my mother, "Clodagh, dear, I think you should buy a 2nd bottle next year." And finally, my last story relates to, I was in rooms in Trinity in my last year of college. I don't know if I'm allowed to mention Trinity when I'm here, but I was. And his housekeeper used to have a day off on a Wednesday. So I used to walk down from college and cook his dinner and eat dinner with him. So I got to know him very well. And at that stage, because I was 21, it was more of an adult to adult conversation. So when I graduated from university, I had to go to Liverpool because it was 1981 and there was no jobs. I got a job as a graduate engineer in a factory that made telephone exchanges. And I used to write to him every week or two, and he would always write back to me. And I was terribly concerned that somebody was looking after his dinners on a Wednesday. So that seemed to be the focus of my attention. Anyway, as we were preparing the archive for UCD, I found a batch of these letters that he had written to me when I was in Liverpool. And I'd like to quote a bit from a few of them because I think it's all very relevant to today. So this letter is dated 27th of February, 1982. So he thanked me for my letter. And he said, "I am delighted that you are finding your work interesting. That's the great thing and far more important than pay, provided you can earn enough to live on." So that showed his attitude to money. He wasn't materialistic. He just said it's more important that you're having fun. He said then, later paragraph, "I'm glad that your relations with the computer are friendly. It is certainly a great advantage that the computer is learning to debug itself." So that was all the way back in 1982. And then his final comment is very relevant today. I'm very well, touching wood. A few new jobs in hand, including a paper in the Statistical Society on the 11th of March. The only time I ever feel tired or out of sorts is when I haven't got enough work. So that was probably the year before he died. I can't remember when he died in 1983. So he was a great believer in continuing to work the whole of his life. He was in the ESRI every day, probably until the week before he died. So thank you very much for taking his archive into UCD, because we would never really have known how to give it a home. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Jill. That was lovely. Now we're now moving on to the, I suppose, the more formal part of tonight's event. And so we have a series of lectures, and the first speaker is my colleague from UCD School of Economics, Dr. Alan de Bromhead. So,
Thank you.
Yeah.
Yeah, should be good. Okay, so thank you everyone for being here today. It's a real honor to be able to talk about Roy Geary and his relationship with data and statistics, particularly in the early years of the state. So what I'm going to do is just talk about a few ways that his work sort of relates to economic history. Much of it is a sort of a personal view from my reading of Roy's work and how it's influenced me. But I also sort of want to talk about economic history more generally, and why Roy's work, when you read it, really resonates for economic historians. So I'm going to touch on three different aspects. So I'm going to look at his the relationship with to living standards over the long run, look at his contribution to early Irish statistics, and I'm only going to scratch the surface. So there may be some things that Patrick has already mentioned that I'll go into a little bit more detail on. And yeah, in the analysis of society. So this is sort of the things that Roy did, which was, really comes through in his work, is that he was sort of made sort of reluctant contributions to theory at times, was absolutely central to building a statistical seriousness into the Irish state. And also then he was keen to analyze statistics. So it wasn't just statistics for statistics' sake, it was really to understand, to solve problems, as Patrick mentioned. But just maybe just before I begin with that, just to show how sort of Roy Geary was influenced by history, not just how sort of he influenced history. This is a poster from the first meeting of the Irish Volunteers, the recruitment meeting in the Rotunda in 1913, and Roy Geary was there. And what comes through from most accounts is that he was a very pragmatic patriot. Okay? He really believed strongly in the idea of an Irish state, and was dedicated to building up the sort of state capacity of Ireland, to building up the statistical work that Ireland did, and putting Ireland at the forefront of this sort of new world of official statistics. And that comes through in his work all the time. You really see that he was trying to establish the best for Ireland, and understanding what was wrong with Irish society, what the problems Irish society faced, and how you could apply statistics to try and understand that. So I think we sort of owe a debt of gratitude to him for establishing this very high standard very early on in an emerging state in the 1920s. Okay, so as Patrick said, when you're an economic historian, usually the first time you come across Roy Geary's name in economic history is in this sort of international dollars, the Geary Camus International Dollars. So this is based on a paper that Roy produced in 1958. It's about 2.5 pages long. And it sort of allowed you to tackle this problem. And again, this is coming from a problem and coming up with a solution. How do we make comparisons about living standards across space in particular, but also for economic historians, it's important to make comparisons across space and time at the same place. Okay, and the goal of trying to make comparisons across space in particular, again, Roy's work, he's always trying to compare across countries. So it's not just looking at Ireland on its own, it's looking at Ireland relative to other countries. So in most papers, when he's trying to analyze something, one of the first things he'll do is to put up a list of comparable data for other countries, just to sort of give you a benchmark. And I think Roy's early work in particular was influenced by C.H. Oldham, who was a professor of economics at UCD, and he was the president of the society as Roy was making his first steps into his career. And this quote sort of sums up what Oldham was about. He says that nobody can know Ireland who only Ireland knows, that you need to make these international comparisons, and to do that you need comparable statistics as well. You need to standardize, you need to have the ability to compare across countries. So for economic history, this is a very important question. Okay? It's a very difficult task, right, to be able to compare across the very long run. Big questions like, when did the Northwest Europe overtake China in terms of living standards? At what point did that happen? When did the United States overtake the UK in terms of being the richest country in the world? Okay, these are big questions that economic historians try to grapple with, try to understand the economic development over the last couple of centuries at the very least, and even further back. So being able to make these comparisons is important. And Roy Geary's work in terms of international dollars comes through in terms of to economic history through its adoption by the International Comparison Project in 1968, through to the Penn World Tables, and then to the Angus Madison's data looking at long-run economic development. Okay, and this has then become the Madison Project, with attempts to update and improve on these statistics over time. So this is the Madison data that you probably are all familiar with, that tries to track living standards over time across a number of different countries, okay, and expressed in these international dollars. So you can compare what living standards were like in the past to living standards today, and also across countries. So this is a really comprehensive data set. And it's very interesting to look at, to try and compare places across time, especially in the very long run. I mean, we can see here that they have observations on living standards in Turkey in the 2,000 years ago. This is giving us a sense of what living standards were like. But the big question is, are they actually accurate? Okay, do these really mean what we think they mean? Are these in many ways misleading? Okay, so a lot of economic history has dedicated itself to trying to understand whether these comparisons are accurate, what really were living standards like at that time, and how did countries relate to each other. But it's a fundamental problem. And if you go back far enough, really, these are just guesses, right? These are informed guesses maybe, but they are not likely to be very accurate. The movement towards improving these data has been taken up by the Madison Project. They're trying to update these benchmarks, but they're still very controversial in economic history. And part of it is because they're trying to do something that is inherently difficult to do, and in some ways impossible to do, to compare what it's like to live today relative to being in the Roman Empire in the year 1. Okay, this is very difficult to do. We can get better with better benchmarks, but we will never really solve this problem in many ways. We can keep trying and ask different questions, but really which way you use depends on the question you're trying to ask, okay, and how you make these comparisons. This index number problem is really an enduring one, okay? And I'm just going to leave it with Peter Neary's judgment on this. As Patrick said, Peter Neary is a big fan of Roy Geary, but he says that the Geary method is to be preferred since it provides an approximate answer to the correct question. And I'm not going to argue with Peter Neary on that. Okay, so as Patrick also mentioned, there's a long history. I'm going to talk a little bit about Roy's contribution to early Irish statistics here. Okay, it goes back to 1901. I couldn't help myself but to look up the Geary family in the 1926 census, as I'm sure you've all done. Okay, and you can see here the Geary family in Drumcondra. Okay, and we have Robert C. Geary here speaks English and Irish. Okay, important to note that as well. And here's his father as the Superintendent of Statistics in the General Register Office. He is Administrative Officer in the Department of Industry and Commerce at this point. So knowing what I do about Irish censuses and censuses in general, again, I went down the rabbit hole a little bit further and looked back to the 1911 census to find the family again. And one of the things you notice is that in the 1926 census, Geary's mother and father are the same age. But if you go back to the 1911 census, there's out by about 3 years. So if we're to use reported ages as a measure of some sort of human capital, you would expect the Geary family would be pretty good in getting the numbers right. So maybe sort of age heaping is a little bit unreliable if the Gearys seem to fail to report accurate ages in a census. His list of contributions in terms of the first official statistics is too long really to go through. The first life tables in 1926, balance of payments estimates, national income and expenditure accounts. I mean, these are things that people have tried to improve on and have used as really important benchmarks for understanding the Irish economy and society in this sort of crucial period of the formation of the state. And Geary's sort of fingerprints are on all of these. I'm going to just pick out a couple of different examples that have, as I said, resonated with my own work and I've come across, in some ways stumbled across, that really were influential and helped me in terms of my own research. So one report that came out in the 1920s was this agricultural output of Saoirstad Éireann. Okay, so this is a really deep dive into the agricultural output of Ireland, and really it becomes clear that what Geary is trying to get at is the concept of value added, and he's really sort of thinking about national income from the bottom up. Okay, and this is a 60-page book, I suppose you'd call it, that really goes into detail and statistics. It really shows you his sort of thirst for knowledge and understanding through data. Now, I've used some of this information. This was crucial. Myself and my co-author, Sean Kenny, recently produced estimates of GDP for Ireland in the 1920s, 30s, 40s, up to the present day at a regional level and at county level. And without this sort of information, that wouldn't have been possible to do in as far back as we could. And the thing with once you sort of know that Roy Geary was involved, you have a certain faith in these statistics. You know that they're going to be as good as you could probably get anywhere in the world. And that really does sort of help you in terms of your confidence of these things. But just as an example, this is the information he took time to plot, or somebody took time to plot for him, about the sort of the yield from cows over the particular period of time after calving. Okay, so all of this information goes into it, trying to look at agricultural yields, trying to look at value added, and this is a 60-page document that goes into this detail. And I think it really sort of emblematic of the sort of approach that Roy Geary took to trying to understand his topic. Okay, so he had to understand all of these things as well. Right? He needed to know about the agricultural structure, about the way that agriculture actually operated at a very micro level. The other thing that this paper or this book shows you is that the commentary, the detail and the footnotes and the explanation that's provided around all the statistics is really, really clear and is consistently excellent. Really, when you look at it and you read it, it tells you exactly what it does. It tells you why it's doing it. It explains at each step of the way. So it's actually very easy to understand and to follow and to just drop into. And that's really clear when you look at a lot of what Roy Geary's work did. Another one I wanted to highlight is the statistical abstract. This is something that is, a treasure trove. It's really the first place Irish economic historians often look if you want to get a headline figure for time series, or if you want to look at a snapshot at a particular time and place in Ireland. It's got all of the usual things that are there in terms of trade and things like that, but it's also a sort of an eclectic mix, and this is what's exciting about it. You just open it up at a particular page and you could find some little nugget that's really informative or interesting, okay? And just picked this one out of it. This is published regularly then afterwards. the number of students, professors and lecturers in universities in each academic year, 1909 to 1910 to 29 to 30. Okay, and this is continued on over time. So we have good time series on these sort of things. If you're interested in these, we have it by sex, and we have the number of professors, etc. Okay, so there's just lots of interesting information. If you want to go even further and look at the results by male and female of degrees across different subjects in Ireland at the time, this is there as well. So it's got the sort of the stuff you'd expect, but also you'll stumble across things that are there that you didn't expect. One thing that in the 1931 abstract is particularly important was the basically backdating, right? They had to take all of the old British statistics, which were for a 32 county Ireland, and try and make them comparable as much as they could by sort of reconfiguring them for a 26 county free state. Okay, and this would have taken a lot of work to actually recompile these statistics at that disaggregated level. This treasure trove, as I say, is now available through the CSO, okay, with joint work with the Centre for Economics, Policy and History. Again, Darren mentioned Trinity, and Queen's, my former employer. Okay, they came together to form this centre, and they have one of the outcomes that they achieved was to get this digitized, and now it's up on the CSO. So all of this wealth of information is there. This is something you can now access much more easily. One more I wanted to mention was the census of distribution. So as we've said, that Roy Geary was a pioneer of statistics. This is a time when statistics were emerging in terms of statistical theory, but there were certain practical things that Roy was interested in terms of generating these statistics. So we have the 1926 census of population and a census of industrial production. Okay, and it was a clear gap that existed for services. Okay, so this is something that the department tried to close by running one of the first of its kind, the first census of distribution in anywhere in the world, perhaps certainly Europe, but perhaps anywhere. This is something the UK didn't manage to get around to until 1950. Okay, so ahead of its time, and if you think about how this is during the Great Depression, effectively. It's a new state, relatively constrained fiscally, okay, that they still managed to produce something pioneering and ahead of its time in terms of statistics is quite remarkable. So if you do want to know how many pubs there were in Dunshaughlin Rural District in 1933 and how much they sold on aggregate, you can find that out. Okay, so this is really detailed, really interesting, and this again helped with trying to reconstruct sort of national accounts or regional accounts for Ireland in the 1920s, something that you would be just guessing at in other contexts. Okay. The third part that I just want to talk about is, and I was trying to sort of say something about his contribution in terms of his applied work and using his statistics. So I just took the first three papers that he published in this society. Patrick's already mentioned one of them, but I will talk about a couple of others as well. This really sets the tone for what his work was like. Okay, and you can see the character come through in these early works. So this is the first paper in 1925, and it's the methods of sampling applied to Irish statistics. He's only sort of a member a year or two at this point. And what he wants to do again is to solve a practical problem. So we have pre-1919, the agricultural statistics are collected, the full sort of census of agriculture by the Royal Irish Constabulary. Okay, this process, this infrastructure gets disrupted by the War of Independence and the Civil War. So they have to rely on sampling until the sort of new process, the new systems are up and running in the mid-1920s. But he's curious to know how accurate these samples are. So he uses the Irish agricultural statistics from the 19th century and then tries to take samples from this to test against this full count. Okay, and he's trying different sample sizes. He's trying to really practically apply to this. But that's not all, and this again is what is quite interesting. It's characteristically clear and pragmatic throughout. He explains exactly how he randomizes he randomizes across these different districts. Okay, But also, I think it's another nice little note here that he acknowledges the use of, I suppose, his computer, right? It should be added that a power sorting and tabulation installation made this experiment but the work of a few hours. Okay, so this is, again, using the most up-to-date sophisticated machinery to try and improve the output of the department. And this was then used in the 1926 census. It hadn't been used in the 1911 census in Ireland, although it had been used in the UK. So this was a new departure, maybe the first time that I've come across anyone sort of mentioning one of these machines in their work. But after looking at this and testing sort of the accuracy of the sampling, he moves on to more philosophical questions about sampling and about when to sample and when you should be using full enumeration and in which context. Okay, and this is sort of where he comes through and says that statisticians will always sort of look for full enumeration. They're not really going to ever want less data. And in some ways he argues that you need the full enumeration to establish what we would call today a sort of a ground truth. Okay, without this absolute sort of fact, we can't really benchmark any of the other things we do against it. And I suppose in the AI age, this is another important observation that Roy was making. So this is where he said also that a statistician is also custodian of the future. Okay, his statistics of today may assume a significance 20 years hence. Okay, so he knows that there's a sort of an obligation to the future of the work that statisticians are doing today. But again, he's characteristically pragmatic. Okay, so he's not saying no to sampling, having shown how accurate his sampling technique was, okay, and how it worked out. He says, but perhaps considering everything, the sample may find its most important applications in the byways of economics, where absolute accuracy is not required, and those questions which must at present remain obscured in the realm of surmise before they are not, if they are not deemed sufficiently important to be examined by a cent per cent enumeration. Okay, so yes to enumeration for the sort of big decennial things, or even 5 years, but where we don't need the same sort of accuracy, or we don't need that ground truth, then we should use the sort of cheaper option and get some sort of a handle on things using sampling. So it's quite interesting sort of about when and when not to use sampling. I won't spend as long on this because Patrick's already mentioned it, but the theme of tuberculosis, and again a pressing problem for Irish society in this period, and one in which Ireland was an outlier, which was something that Roy Geary was trying to explain and understand. Okay, this is his second paper to the Society. He's very direct from the start. This is his opening line. There were 3,744 deaths from tuberculosis in Saoirstad Éireann in 1929. Okay, that's a great way to open a paper on tuberculosis. But as Patrick mentioned, there's a remarkable range of empirical evidence that he brings to bear on this. So he tries to look at evidence from across different countries. He looks at immigrants in the US in terms of the Irish immigrants in the US and how they fared at tuberculosis. He tries to do all sorts of standardization. He looks across the country, and as Patrick said, he looks. He actually asks a geologist to prepare him this map that he can then use to look at the different soil in Wexford to see whether there's a correlation, which there is, between the soil type and the TB rate. Now, whether that's spurious or not, I think that's probably what Patrick was suggesting earlier on. But nonetheless, the curiosity and the inquisitiveness of his approach is something that stands out as quite remarkable. And he is looking for a causal story. He's not trying to claim anything, but he's careful. He's very careful not to jump to any conclusions, and he's very aware of those sort of biases that are in the data and what needs to be done to get closer to the truth, let's say. And this is the sort of quote that struck me when I read it, because it did inspire us in another paper that I'm working with Ronan Lyons and Johan Uller, looking at public health in Ireland and mortality from disease. Okay, and it said it would be extremely valuable for future guidance in combating this or other diseases to be able to show that the counties which exhibit the greatest declines in mortality are just those counties in which the public health activities are most pronounced, Perhaps some inquirer with special knowledge will examine these statistics in this sense. So this was sort of where we were very happy to sort of try and answer this call in some way, to try and look at the relationship between this sort of public health policy and mortality in Ireland in that period. Okay, the final paper, just to mention, this is the third paper that he presented to the Society by 1935, and is another theme of his work, which was to look at population. Okay, so he was interested again in the problems of Ireland, population and emigration being pressing issues in this period, and he tries to project the population up to 2016. Really, the goal, I mean, the accuracy of the projections were not the point. It was more to just use the sort of fertility rates and life tables to be able to come up with an estimate, at least, of population. And it's really about debunking this misconception that because emigration had stopped during the Depression, or effectively dropped down, that the Irish population would recover quite quickly to the sort of pre-famine level, which seems to be what you can see he's trying to get at. But then, you know, that lasts for a few pages, but then he sort of gets curious, right? He gets curious into trying to answer what's going on. This is the opening of that paper, where he sort of apologizes and breaks his own rule, because one of the things he said was that he wanted people to be interested in the past, but really only because it's going to help you make better policy in the future. But he can't help himself in this. He says that he goes into digressions, sometimes into the distant past, not always with a view to extrapolation into the future. If these digressions depart too much from the main theme, it is hoped that they will compensate, in however small degree, in interest for what they lack in relevance. Okay? So this is his apology at the start. But there's all sorts of things he gets into. It's really interesting, the sort of, that you can see his curiosity and his intellectual journey through this. And it's always very rigorous and very thoughtful. Okay, just let me finish maybe with some things that aspects of Roy's work that sort of resonate, I think, with academic historians, but certainly with me. One thing that sort of comes through very clearly, which economic historians like, is a very careful approach to data. Obviously, he's a statistician, but he cares about the data, he cares about the sources, he's aware of the biases, how it's constructed, what's behind the data. So he's not just sort of using data without thinking, as economic historians sometimes accuse economists of doing incorrectly, right? They're not using the sources and not taking them seriously enough. You know, I really appreciate the clarity with which he explains things, the detail and the transparency over how things are created. But also, for economic historians, we often have to be a bit imaginative. We don't have necessarily all of the data that we would like to have. And you need to be a bit creative as to how you sort of stitch together all of these different varied indicators. And I think that comes through in Roy Geary's work as well. And likewise, that leads you into sort of broad interests of Roy Geary. He has lots of different topics he's interested in, and he follows his curiosity in many ways, but always guided by this sort of problems that he observes that the Irish economy has. This is just a quote from the 1935 paper I mentioned, that statistics alone are not sufficient to understand something. So this, in terms of identification in economics, this is something that seemed to predate that. It was useless to calculate correlation coefficients unless there were common sense grounds for believing that a relationship existed. In our words, we would call that the mechanism now, right? There's no point in just showing a correlation, even if it's very well identified, unless you can have some sort of grounding in why you might expect to find that. The final slide, I just want to leave it because this really struck me, as a quote by an article by Brendan Walsh in tribute to Roy Geary. I can recall his delight on receiving a new volume of a census of population or industrial production, two of his favourite statistical sources, and the enthusiasm with which he would announce, "Here be riches." And I think that really sums it up. Okay, so thank you.
Sorry, we only have one microphone. So thank you very much, Alan. I'd now like to introduce Professor Martina Lawless, who's the director of the ESRI. And I'll hand over the one microphone.
Oh, no. See if I can attach microphone.
Good. I don't have slides, so I'm going to leave this great slide up because I think it links to a lot of what I am going to say. So thank you very much for the invitation to speak here today. It's a great pleasure to sort of pay tribute to the long-lasting legacy of Roy Geary in terms of the use of statistics. And I'm going to focus a little bit from taking it from Alan's historical view and Patrick's overview of Geary's life, sort of through Geary's work at the ESRI and the use of statistics in research and policy making, sort of right up to the present day, and then Sarah will take on for more of today and into the future. So we've got a sort of a whole kind of breadth through time, I think, in terms of the layout of today's speakers. So in terms of the influence of Roy Geary, obviously we've already mentioned that he was the first director of the ESRI, and many of you here may have visited the ESRI building, and you'll have seen that when you walk into the lobby, there's a picture of T.K. Whitaker, who was the sort of initial sort of founder of the Institute. But there's another portrait up on the third floor, which is a portrait of Roy Geary, just next to the director's office. So he's sort of quite literally keeping an eye on me and maintaining his legacy in my role there. Patrick also touched on one of my favorite stories, which is not only was Roy Geary the first director of the ESRI, but having Roy Geary lined up for that position was really crucial to the establishment of the ESRI, and particularly to getting the Ford Foundation to put up some of the initial funding. And it was important in terms of having sort of an independent research and policy agency, that not all of the funding came from the state, that it gave it that sort of separation and independence. And Roy Geary's quality mark was really important there. There is another bit. Patrick said they wrote to the Ford Foundation. There is a nice footnote in the biography of T.K. Whitaker to say that Whitaker and his young civil servant, Thomas Kinsella, who went on to a rather different career path as a poet not long afterwards, also went to New York and essentially stalked the secretary of the Ford Foundation by going to the same morning mass every day for a week until the money was put up for the ESRI. But on to more the present day, and Geary's belief, I think, in the importance of data and evidence in policy making are at least as important today as they ever were. But I think in many ways, when you look at the sort of the flurry of commentary, AI, era of disinformation and misinformation, possibly even more important that there are kind of sort of trusted sources of data and evidence and policy making to enable sort of policymakers to navigate that very fast moving and much more sort of full sense of data kind of that there is out there. And one of the kind of quotes I came across when looking at the CSO's website and some of the tributes they had paid to Geary and some of his own early writings, a great quotation whereby he called the publication of independent statistical information one of the greatest privileges and safeguards of a free democracy. And I think that's a sort of an amazing quote, to take the statistics away from sort of like the technical production into the importance of trust and evidence and good information to lead kind of good policy making. And that reliable evidence, I think, is very central to enabling governments, to identify problems, to allocate resources, to understand the trade-offs that are being made, and to evaluate outcomes honestly, and also to adapt policy when circumstances change. We can see from the changing focus of official statistics from agriculture to intellectual property that the economic situation, the structure of the economy changes over time. And so the type of statistics and the type of evidence that are collected also needs to change to reflect those the changing world around us. So one of the points there on democratic societies depending on trusted institutions and good evidence for public debate. I think we see the role of somewhere like the Central Statistics Office, which Roy Geary was also initially led for probably longer than he was at the ESRI, but everybody likes to claim him as their own, so most of my comments are going to reflect on the ESRI side. And another, before moving on to more specific examples, to pull another quote from a later ESRI director, Brendan Whelan, who was reflecting on Roy Geary's work, said, it is only by empirical evidence that the orders of magnitude so necessary for policy research can be established. And I think that captures something very important about taking the data into policy making, you'll often from public discourse or from common sense know the direction of an effect. If it's something is positive or negative. But the effective kind of formulation of policy really depends on the scale and the proportion and the measurement. So how big is that effect? Which sectors of the economy are most impacted by that change or by that policy? How large is the problem? What interventions are going to produce meaningful results as opposed to just kind of making around the margins, and what are the long-term fiscal consequences? So those elements of putting things in proportion and measurement are really important. And I guess those are some of the big questions then that Whittaker and Geary set up the ESRI to measure and analyze the data and to try to come up with answers for it. Some of the big questions, of course, at the time were the kind of the extreme level of economic stagnation in Ireland. So they were looking at, what was wrong with the economic model? Why was the country so stagnant? What could be done about the extraordinarily high levels of outward migration at the time, with hundreds of thousands of people leaving the country in search of economic opportunity elsewhere? And Whittaker and Geary, I think, both recognised that economic decline wasn't inevitable, and that there were changes to the economic structure that could be studied, that could be measured, and that could be addressed with policy. But then as now, resources were limited. They had to understand what was going to work most effectively and what was going to make the biggest difference to people's lives. And that's where the research and the evidence really had to be targeted. Moving on to sort of more recent analysis of where data is used in policy making, and where kind of looking at the data cannot always kind of give you the right answers. So the financial crisis of 2008 was one example where we see the sort of consequences of insufficient, perhaps, analytical scrutiny. Obviously, in contrast to the 1960s, the issues in the early 2000s was that the economy was booming. We had enormous levels of confidence that we had cracked the economic model and that everything was going fantastically well. Economic growth, tax revenues were all booming. But beneath that, we had serious structural vulnerabilities building up in the economy. Excessive dependence on property-related taxes, unsustainable credit expansion, rising household indebtedness, and an over-reliance, of course, on cyclical taxes coming from the property sector. And many of those warnings were visible in the data. Warnings were given about the data, but the level of confidence that everything was going well was perhaps greater than some of the warning voices. And one of the central sort of analytical failures before that was perhaps the confusion of those temporary tax revenues coming from the property sector with kind of a fundamental kind of improvement in the fiscal sustainability of the country. And of course, that's an element that we're addressing again today. The ESRI, many other commentators from across the policy system and within it, very much focusing on looking at the composition of the public finances, the increased reliance on corporation taxes, the heavy concentration of those taxes within a small number of countries. And so the evidence is there kind of and still important to focus on. The context changes, the specific kind of areas of vulnerability change, but the importance of looking deeply at the data, not just at the headlines that tax revenues are growing marvelously, GDP of the country is expanding rapidly, but where are those growths coming from? What are the risks that bring it with it? That deep dive into always the data, again, in line very much with the sort of Geary model. It's not just the top level results, it's kind of looking down into the distribution in order to kind of really understand what's going on and where are the kind of the trade-offs being made. And I think, coming out of that financial crisis, a lot of increased resources were put into more evidence-based policy making. The fiscal oversight structures were particularly, with the setting up of IFAC, strengthened considerably. And I think to a decent extent, policymakers became more attentive to stress testing, scenario analysis, and some more focus on long-term sustainability. So the evidence has become more embedded in more recent years in the policy making, perhaps precisely because we saw that example where insufficient scrutiny could have really damaging effects for the economy. So So taking another example of where evidence-based policy making within the ESRI in particular has put a lot of focus on, as I think the Geary Institute does as well, is in labour market policy. And this is where we have a lot of analytical evidence on standards and social equality. So we've increasingly relied on detailed labour market data over the last number of years on looking at areas like skills shortages, labour force participation, migration, educational attainment. Links nicely to as something Geary was measuring back quite early on. And research, I think, from the CSO and the ESRI has informed a lot of debates there on everything from childcare poverty to the minimum wage. And these discussions also kind of bring up another important point, which is the quality of that policy analysis depends very heavily on the quality of the underlying data infrastructure. And Jennifer knows what I'm going to say next, because this is a bit of a bugbear of us all in the labour market analysis side, which is that even in a country with good, strong statistical infrastructure, with a lot of evidence being kind of collected on an ongoing basis, there can still be gaps in the data that lead to gaps in the policy analysis. And in particular, in terms of analysis of labour market issues like minimum wage, like gender pay gaps, like underemployment, we have very little information on hours worked. Revenue Commissioner collects everybody's PAY, every single pay slip and tax payment in the country, but they don't ask people, how many hours did it take you to earn that income? And without that, it's very difficult to know, is that a well-off person, in a full-time job, or a really well-off person in a part-time job? Or is that low income because that person only worked 10 hours, or because they're on a really low wage? And there's a lot of questions that really, and a lot of really important policy issues that can't be looked at in depth because of some of that missing information. So it sounds like a sort of technical issue, but the implications of it in terms of policy are quite substantial. And I guess that's kind of one of the broader lessons, and Roy Geary would be very behind this, which is that evidence-based policy making, it's not just about analysing the existing information, it's also about thinking what's the pieces of information that we'd like to have that aren't there, and strengthening the overall data infrastructure so that you have the systems in place. And again, maybe to future-proof, you don't know what statistics might be more important in the future. The services industry, maybe we started looking at it in the 1930s, it only became the dominant sector much later. So that the relative weight of some of those statistics can change over time. Housing data is the other place where the ESRI is putting a huge amount of focus at the moment for really strong evidence on relationships between population, growth, household formation, infrastructure provision, construction capacity are all areas where good information is crucial to not just dealing with the policy questions and priorities of today, but also looking forward towards those of the next 10, 20, 30 years. Which links, of course, to the great example there that Geary was one of the first people to do some demographic projections. And demographic projections are sort of my final example. And I did come up with this sort of independently of Alan, but it links very well. In terms of policymakers often very focused on the immediate crisis, with good evidence again and good data on how things are likely to evolve into the future on slower, maybe moving structural change shifts, like a growing population, but also the change in the age structure of the population and what that means for service demands and policy into the future. A lot of those kind of pieces of analysis, and I think particularly from independent agencies that can look beyond the sort of the political cycle, are important in thinking seriously about sustainability, sort of in terms of public services, in terms of public finances, in terms of environmental sustainability over decades rather than just in the very short term. And I think that demographic policy is one of the clearest examples of where the evidence kind of matters because it does evolve kind of very slowly. Of course, as both Patrick and Alan mentioned, statistics can be incomplete. Economic behavior can change over time. So it's not enough to have a kind of, the infrastructure can't be frozen in time. Societies change. Not everything that matters socially, of course, can be kind of easily quantified. Many very important dimensions of social well-being, we're trying to measure them in better ways. There's, you know, social cohesion, trust, or kind of social outcomes becoming more a focus of perhaps measurement. But not everything that matters can be measured easily, and particularly not through conventional economic indicators. And just to kind of on that, you know, there's a lot of further challenges both towards the kind of the statistics system and towards research in terms of evidence, which is we're in an era of sort of very rapid change in terms of, you know, increased, you know, use of AI, how that can be very valuable for data collection, but also kind of difficult and a challenge in terms of like what data, you know, how easy it is to kind of come up with data that's not trustworthy and accurate. Climate transition, demographic aging, how to measure productivity in a kind of very different world from the one that Geary was trying to measure, where you can't go out and, you know, agricultural output at least had the benefit of, you know, you could go out and just physically count it in many ways, which you can't really do with a lot of the services that are dominating the economy today. So that brings a lot of uncertainty into the economic world, and it brings a lot of uncertainty into research and even into data collection. But having the foundation of the data infrastructure and good analysis are crucial to allowing sort of that uncertainty to be navigated. It can't be gotten rid of, but it can be navigated and given the kind of the stronger signals to policymakers, perhaps in terms of adapting and learning and measuring those trade-offs properly. So I'm going to perhaps wrap it up there. I say that maybe good data doesn't always produce good policy, but you're not going to have good policy without good data. And I think Roy Geary would be on board with that.
Going to have to get another microphone. Thank you very much, Martina. And now our final speaker is Sarah Glavey, who heads the Public Sector Transformation Programme in DPER and is also an incoming expert resident in the Geary Institute's expert residency programme. So just to say thank you very much for stepping in to cover your colleague who's ill this evening.
Yes, no problem. So if the talk goes well, I'll take credit for it. If it doesn't go well, I'll blame my boss. Great. Yes, perfect. Yeah, great. I have a couple of slides and yeah, set up here. Great, thank you. Yeah. Okay, is that okay in terms of sound? Yeah, great. Yeah, thank you very much. So I'm delighted to be here. Thank you very much for the invitation and to round out this session and hopefully to be the token or representative civil servant or policymaker in the room. I think it's a really nice programme, and hopefully I'll just give another complementary angle, I think, on what's been discussed this evening. So thanks a lot for the opportunity. I think a lot of what I say will resonate. I think Martina's given a fantastic account there of why data is so important to policy making and to decision making to support government and the delivery of the programmes that we all hope to deliver through our public policy and the implementation of the policy. So great piece of work also. I'll give it a plug from ESRI, working with the Department of Finance, the Future 40 piece of work, which gives I suppose an account of this changing and very, I suppose, complex world that we face as policy makers currently. All of these kind of big trends that are happening in our environment are kind of probably familiar really to us at this stage from kind of public discourse. But I suppose we are in a very rapidly changing environment, as Martina mentioned. And I suppose what we find then, and I suppose what I'll talk about hopefully, is the infrastructure and the interventions that we're trying to make centrally to really support policy development and to build the data that's needed to tackle these complex challenges, which is what we're, I think, all here for. So more agile and responsive and even more importance placed on data for policy development. For policy development and delivery of services. So I suppose we always have this kind of implementation gap when we talk about policy. And I know we're all kind of familiar with that probably in this room, but that intertwining of policy and delivery when we talk about data is quite an interesting, there's quite a lot of interest in that area at the moment. And I want to talk a little bit about different types of data that we're seeing coming into decision making as a result, beyond kind of probably our traditional understanding of national statistics. Wider context as well. I suppose there's a lot of activity in the European context that shapes our own policy environment. So a real focus in the environment, in the European context, on utilising data and digital resources as the driver of competitiveness. So this is sort of the lifeblood of our economy at this stage, and this is how a lot of the work on digital and data is being framed. A big impetus as well to simplify digital and data regulation, and I think some of the audience here might be quite interested in that aspect too. I think because some of the regulation around data perhaps has had some unintended consequences on the way that policymakers behave when it comes to things like data protection. We'll come back to some of those challenges as well. So I suppose in terms of interventions, we have our Better Public Services policy. So this is the central government policy for driving transformation of our public services. So really that is all about equipping our public service, including our civil service, for these future challenges. The areas of focus are, you'll be glad to see the third one. So we're very happy that evidence-informed policy and services is not a topic or a priority that's gone anywhere at all. We've heard of the illustrious history of this topic, and it's really front and centre still for government and for policymakers. So the other two areas, which are of course interrelated, digital and innovation at scale. So really taking advantage of the opportunity of digitalisation to drive transformation of our public services. Again, as we digitalise, the volume of data, as I said, is massively increased. So how do we take advantage of that data? How do we put an order on it in the first instance is a huge challenge for the public service. So then workforce and organisation of the future. In this context, how do we upskill our public and civil servants to develop the skills that are needed to deal with data and evidence, and good analysis is kind of a core challenge as well. So yeah, remains a priority. So good news, hopefully. There's a huge infrastructure that's developed around data and around evidence in recent years, and it's a really rich ecosystem. And I suppose everybody here, probably with the different organisational backgrounds that you have, are probably part of that ecosystem as we would see it, and many initiatives to build on. So the way we're implementing that policy and those interventions, I suppose, is through a series of cross-government flagship programmes, so where we identify key transformation priorities, and then because it's a huge, a huge endeavour, public service bodies themselves are driving transformation across all of those different agendas as well. So I suppose with regard to flagship programmes, one of the areas of focus at the moment, and colleagues in the CSO in particular are big partners in this, is the development of a new public service data strategy. And that has given us an opportunity to really look at what's needed to drive the strategic use of data right across our public service. So I'll talk a little bit about what we've learned through that process so far. First of all, though, just to echo maybe some of what's been discussed already in terms of why all of this is such an important foundation to all of what we're trying to achieve in delivering on government policy. The OECD Trust Survey is a key source for us in tracking kind of trust of the public in our public institutions. It's at the core of what we're trying to do with public service transformation, keep the trust of the public so that government programmes can be implemented and adopted. CSO run this survey every 2 years and feed into that wider global picture. And interesting, I suppose, plug, CSO have just run that most recent round of data collection a couple of months ago, and the next set of results will be out in the summer, and we'll be doing a lot to kind of promote those results. I'm not going to read out everything that's there, but it gives a kind of a sort of nice smattering of statistics for the statisticians in the room. But I'll just point to one or two of them. So I suppose high level trust in national government, 47% of the public say that they trust national government. It compares to a 39% OECD average, so that sounds okay, but actually not great. And I think the flip side of that, if I'm right, and hopefully CSO colleagues won't correct me if I'm wrong, but I think it's 41% don't trust national government. So really, that's quite a challenging picture. What's probably an interesting driver, so there's a lot of work done on the drivers of that trust, and one of the figures here, 41% say that government takes decisions, they believe that government takes decisions based on evidence. And again, that's bang on the OECD average. But when you dig into the drivers of trust, that's a really important one. And actually the use of evidence, the perception of use of evidence by government to inform decision making is one of the strongest drivers of trust in national government. So really interesting to see that, I suppose what we would all feel to be important spelled out very clearly there. There's some other interesting statistics there around kind of our rankings in terms of digital government and open data as well, making our public administrative data available for other uses. We score quite highly, but also these rankings give us plenty of information in terms of areas for improvement as well. So when we looked at our development of our data strategy, and again, this has been a very kind of interesting opportunity and instructive process for us to look right across the public service and see again a little bit about how are we getting on, okay, and building that infrastructure to support use of data. What we see really is, first of all, a really strong ecosystem in many ways, and just point to a couple of developments that are really positive and promising and give us those good international rankings really as well. So thriving, have to call out in UCD now, vibrant higher education and research and development sector, but certainly that is really acknowledged and a core part of this ecosystem. We've a mature network of analysts within the system, and I think Martina was talking about this or alluded to this, like in the wake of the financial crisis, the establishment of the Government Economic and Evaluation Service was a key reform. And actually that's how many years ago now, 10 plus years ago. So the bedding in of those analysts in the system has provided a really important internal capacity alongside the National Statistical Service built up by the CSO. And we see these analysts and these professionals working together increasingly within government departments and some public service bodies as well. And the establishment of models of established data and analytics divisions growing as well. So all of that is enormous progress, I suppose, really in a relatively short amount of time in terms of our skills development and the capacity that we have to work with data and analysis within the system, as well as the vibrant sector around that and the partners in academia and in research institutes such as we're highlighting this evening. Lots of pockets of excellence in different types of functions that we need in the data system as well. So the CSO's work on the virtual data rooms is an initiative that allows for working in a secure environment with linked data between different government bodies, looking at key policy problems and bringing together the relevant data. There's lots of interesting centres of expertise, some of them again associated with the university. So the ADAPT Centre here, which UCD is involved with alongside other universities, excellent kind of world-leading research in terms of the application of AI. So we've lots of pockets of excellence. We've growing strength within the data ecosystem. But I suppose we also uncovered quite a lot of challenges, and these are maybe the ones to turn your brains to as a group of kind of very I suppose, interested and educated people in this room. Lots of challenges still, okay, to really achieving what we want, which is over here, okay? So what we'd really like is this sort of integrated, data-driven public service. We really want data to be informing, kind of routinely informing policy development, service planning and delivery, and the delivery of outcomes, including all of the steps along the way that Martina captured really well. So evaluation, so planning right through to evaluation. Some of the issues that we have at the moment, so let me draw your attention to a couple of them. Data sharing between institutions and linking of data is very patchy and non-standardized. So despite a lot of effort and a lot of work on data governance, despite a lot of focus on protection of data, which remains a core priority, what we've sort of seen is a bit of a chilling effect of GDPR among public sector bodies and employees, kind of confusion or perhaps well, I think legitimate confusion about what to do with different types of data, what's possible, what needs to be protected, what doesn't. And sometimes using GDPR as a bit of an excuse, okay? So a bit too much of a convenient excuse to not do something, okay? So that's an issue of kind of delay or sort of stagnation, I think. Then with other sorts of data, kind of a lack of formal agreements and processes for sharing of data, okay? The infrastructure that we have and the ease at which that's actually possible to do is also very kind of fragmented and not consistent. Enormous amount of work going into data quality and consistency, so cleaning of data and preparation of data for exchange. One of my colleagues told me people are embarrassed as well, okay, so they're not really sure if the data that they have or that they've collected is good enough to be shared and to be used, and that can be kind of a behavioural constraint as well. That's a lot of stuff probably on the supply side. On the demand side, I think yes, awareness of data available. People, despite several initiatives in this area, including from CSO, including from ourselves, actually the Office of Government Chief Information Officer, to create metadata catalogues and have that data available. Still not sure, okay, not sure exactly where to look and where to go for the data is something that we hear very frequently. And then skills are mixed. So really good specialist skills, which we've invested in, but level of skills among generalist civil servants and policymakers needing some work. So that gives a little bit of a sense. There's a couple of other things there, but I think quite an interesting insight into, as you said, the reality of what's going on at the moment among the people that we really want to be using the data on a consistent basis. We have this kind of idea of data maturity curves, okay, and this is just one example, but when we kind of take stock, we think that, look, we're kind of on a journey, of course, and we're sort of somewhere in the middle here between a kind of an experimenter and a good adopter in how we deal with data. So we've got pockets of excellence, but we still have disconnections within our kind of data ecosystem. We want to move towards this great utopia. Look down here at the end. I don't think it's a final destination, but moving this trajectory, we see other countries that are doing particularly well. Often we get pointed towards Baltic or Nordic countries, so we can see examples of where particularly some smaller countries have made huge progress in what they're able to do. The strategy is still under development, so I can't give you a copy of it, unfortunately, yet, but sneak kind of preview, which won't be too surprising. The direction of travel is really to try to focus our interventions on these kind of three areas. And the first one is about that data access. Okay, so collecting, linking and accessing data, making that a lot easier for everybody who wants to use it, both within the public service and other users outside. Creating value, which all of you are very interested in too. So working closely with all of the users of public data, again, inside and outside the public service, to make sure that we are deriving value, that it is informing analysis, it's informing decision making, and also that it's also driving other uses such as innovation, both within the public service and more broadly. And then this key focus on maintaining public trust, because as we said, some of our stats are okay on public trust, but we all know that the environment that we're in is posing increasing challenges, and also that that kind of trust is easily lost and not easily lost, and what is it, hard won and easily lost. Just to finish up, I suppose to call out again some real areas of innovation at the moment when we're talking about this data ecosystem and kind of exciting uses, I suppose, going forward. As I said, our analysts and our kind of the building up that capacity within the public service is a real area of strength, and it's an area of future development. Joining up of skills as well, of data roles and analytical roles and other related roles is going to be a big area of potential for us. Down here, all these things are just I know colored things to be explained, but I won't go into all. But I just to say, there's a lot of work as well on standardization of policy development within the civil and public service, and this is a kind of an acknowledgement of that work, and it's a very interesting I suppose opportunity as well, because it positions data and evidence alongside all the other inputs to policy development. So as a core part, but also I suppose trying to give a sense of how it does sit and add to that kind of picture. Qualitative data and how we use insight from service delivery is a huge area of development. So that challenges us in both the type of data that we need to handle and also the methods that we need to use. And that's a real area of development. And then, of course, AI. I'll just finish up with to acknowledge a collaboration that we've had recently between the CSO and some students in UCD using our government open data portal, which has been great. And it's just a nice example of working together across that ecosystem to derive value. So students here were using CSO's high value data sets to I suppose to use their skills, I understand, and develop their skills in data visualization and to discuss some kinds of pressing problems as they saw it. So some of these visualizations have to do with, again, that demographic change trajectory that Martina was highlighting earlier, but like great examples of collaboration that are ongoing. And really for the future, again, I think that sums up what I've been hopefully saying, but I guess lots of promise, lots of opportunity, and look out for our forthcoming National Public Service Data Strategy. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. We're running slightly over. We started 5 minutes late. Are we? Do we have time? Jennifer's in charge, so do we have time for questions?
Maybe take a few questions.
Will we
or stories?
take a few questions? So would anyone like to comment on this evening's events or ask a question? No. Oh, good. Thanks, Paul.
Well, I just want to show gratitude to everyone who's presented. I think it's been a really enjoyable, whoever came up with this session are geniuses. I think it worked extremely well. And maybe we could institutionalize them in the sense that we could take people from history into society and to really build this as a framework for honouring people in the past and building forward.
Yeah, I think that's a lovely idea. Yes, yeah. So the committee of the Statistical and Social Inquiry Society came up with the agenda. We approached them in the Geary Institute because we wanted to do something to mark this very kind donation. But I think that's a great idea. Yeah, it definitely has worked very well. So thank you. Any other questions? Oh yes. Oh, no. I
just make one comment. I think my name is Fergal Roy. I'm a retired development person. I just think what we've heard today would say that Roy Geary must be regarded as one of the architects of modern Ireland, and that should be an explicit finding of today. A lot of this topic people say this person and that person, but I think it's very clear that Roy is very much prominent among those.
Yes, thank you. That's very well put. Okay, so do we have any other questions? No. Well, if not, I think that's a very nice a note to end. And I'd like to invite everybody to join us for a reception to mark today's seminar in honour of Roy Geary and the donation of the Geary family of his archive. Including a glass or two of wine, because my administrative colleagues have spent a week filling out UCD paperwork to get a wine license. So I would encourage you to partake. Thank you very much. Thanks for